What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, so I saw Brother Ticker TV talking about Scottie Pippen and whether or not Scottie would have been better without Jordan, and what type of player he would have been without Jordan, and whether Michael Jordan made Scottie or whether they both made each other, and that type of debate. And I guess it was going over on the player's choice. And this is my take on it, man. Longtime Bulls fan. Watched the entire championship run of the Bulls. And, look, let me say this first of all. None of us are saying that Scottie Pippen was not an all-time great player. Okay? He's generally considered the greatest defensive small forward ever. Okay? So that's that. If you consider someone the greatest defender at their position ever, then you can't be a bum. Okay? We're not saying that he's a bum. We're not. And I think that sometimes get lost in translation. He is not a bum, okay? He was great. It's just that Scottie was probably the first guy who was proof, or was one of the first players that showed that championships can sometimes super elevate players past what they really were. And I'm going to tell you just from a Bulls fan perspective. I remember, now look, we didn't have social media back in 1993, right? But still, the sports talk that we read sports articles from sports writers and journalists, and they did talk, have little segments on ESPN or other sports shows on TV, and they would talk about the Bulls. And when Michael Jordan retired abruptly in October of 1993, this is what I do remember vividly. This is around the time when they would say Scottie and Mike were the two best players in the NBA, right? And this is when Scottie was expected to take over for Mike. Because there were a lot of people who thought, there were some people now, that thought Jordan was holding Scottie back. Right? And the expectations from some of these people was that now Scottie, now that Mike's gone, he was expected by some to put up Jordan-esque numbers or close to it. He wasn't quite as physically gifted as Mike, but there were people that thought, and I was one of them, I didn't think he was on Mike's level, but I thought Scottie was going to make a huge jump. I thought Scottie was going to, because of the hype and hoopla at the time, I thought Scottie was going to go from averaging like 18, 19, 20 to like 26, 27 points a game. Now, I didn't think the Bulls were going to do very well from a team standpoint, but I thought Scottie was going to do just good enough to get this team to the playoffs. Maybe a first-round exit, and they could build on something. And then as a Bulls fan, you always hoped that Mike would change his mind and come back at some later date. But what did we see? We saw Scottie go from averaging maybe 19 points a game to 22 points a game. It wasn't this huge, increase. No, it wasn't. Now, you could argue some of it was loss of offensive firepower, playing at a slower pace, If I'm not mistaken, I think the Bulls went from averaging something around 103 points per game to 96 points per game. So the pace slowed. So Scottie's 22 points per game kind of meant a little more than on the surface, but still, it wasn't the incremental increase in output and production that we thought he was going to get from Scottie. But what helped Scottie in some people's eyes, as far as, oh man, this is a guy that's underrated, was the team's success. You know, the Bulls won a surprising 55 victories that year. And that comes with Scottie missing the first 10 games of the season. When I think the Bulls went like 10 and 2 and 8 or 3 and 7. So I think it was 3 and 7. So hell, they could have had a better record than they had the year before had Scottie played all 82 games. So what you guys say now, Mr. Sewell? What you guys say now, too, Raw? Well, I do want to say this, and I've said this before as my argument. Part of the reason why the Bulls did so phenomenally well compared to other teams is that, number one, you had an excellent coaching staff in place with Phil Jackson, Tex Winter, Johnny Bach, Jim Clemens, and some others. I believe John Paxson briefly joined them in the coaching ranks and then went to a front office job, if I'm not mistaken. So they had an excellent coaching staff. They had an excellent strategy for how to, by committee, to do their best to make up for the lack of 32 points per game in the starting lineup. All right? B.J. Armstrong scoring went up. Pippen scoring went up. Pete Myers, who I think went on to become the starter, he wasn't a scorer, but he was a good defensive player. So you didn't lose that much on the defensive end at the shooting guard position. Luke Longley was there. Luke Longley, yeah, he only gave you 9 points a game, 10 points a game, but that was more than what was giving you before. Bill Cartwright, who was aging. And Horace Grant had a career year averaging 14, 15, and 11. So his scoring was up. So everybody's scoring went up. There was more shot attempts, and it was all equally distributed, even into the bench. But more importantly, you saw the arrival of Tony Kukoc. All right? Tony Kukoc, the Croatian sensation. That was his first year in the NBA. He had an immediate impact for that team. And he really helped them on some nights when they lacked offensive punch. Then you had Steve Kerr come in. Statistically, the greatest three-point shooter, at least from a percentage standpoint, the game has ever seen. All right, so you had all these guys who were part of the mid to late 90s Bulls teams come in, part of that nucleus. Whereas with other teams that broke up, the coaching staff was fired, most of the players were traded away, or what have you, were injured, and the total franchise fell apart. But that wasn't the case with the Chicago Bulls. So that's part of it. Matter of fact, if you think about it, if you put Michael Jordan on this team, this 93-94 team, they'd probably perform like the 96 Bulls if Michael Jordan was in his prime. They would be like the 96 Bulls, but better. That's all they were. They really were the 96 Bulls, but if you take Michael Jordan off of a really, really good team, they're still going to win 50-something games. But with Michael, they were a dynasty super team. So that's to answer that, at least from my perspective. Now, as far as Scottie is concerned, Scottie was initially drafted by the Seattle Supersonics in 1987, but he was traded on draft night to Chicago for Olden Polynice. The Bulls did not need an Olden Polynice. At the time, they needed a small forward because they'd already acquired, or were already going to acquire, uh, Horace Grant, but they wanted a small forward, so they traded for Scottie Pippen. I believe sincerely that if Scottie Pippen had not played with Michael Jordan, I don't think he would have been a perennial All Star. I think he would have been a guy that was better than Plastic Man. And when I say Plastic Man, I'm talking about Stacey Augmon. He'd have been better than him, but not a perennial All Star. He'd have been somewhere between a role player, a really, really good role player, and a cusp All Star type guy. Like, I think he'd have been better than Robert Ory, but not a perennial All Star. I think he'd have been in that vicinity. You know, that type of player. Like, you know how Walt Williams was in his best days. Like Walt Williams with the Kings. It hurt that he played on a bad team, but Walt Williams had the talent to be an All-Star. But he was a great role player. He'd have been a great role player on a championship team. That's how I would have seen Scottie if he had played anywhere else, almost anywhere else other than playing under the tutelage of a Michael Jordan. But let's think about it. A lot of people criticize Michael Jordan's, style, saying it was dictatorship and domineering and all of that, right? But all of the guys who failed, all of those players that failed, weren't they pretty much out the league anyway? Which means that they would not have lasted anyway. They didn't have the mental strength. They didn't have the that gumption to be able to last in the NBA back in those days. The Brad Sellers, the other guys that, he dug into and they didn't last very long and shit. But it's funny, a lot of those role players for the Bulls, right? It's funny that Isaiah Thomas mentions how, oh man, all these role players from the Pistons that Bulls picked up. But what about all these role players for Chicago that went elsewhere and helped other teams to win based upon playing with Michael Jordan? Nobody thought much of Steve Kerr before he played in Chicago. He was barely trying to stay in the league, right? Struggling to stay in the league. But he became a respected elder statesman of the NBA and helped the San Antonio Spurs win championships. And he was a positive force on those Portland Jailblazers teams. Look what Scott Williams did. Scott Williams went, he played for a long time, I think into the mid-2000s. He went to other teams, Milwaukee and other teams, Philadelphia, and wherever he went, he was a positive force, and he usually played on teams that overperformed. Look at Horace Grant. Horace Grant. He went to Orlando. His very first year, they went to the NBA Finals. This was only, 3 years removed from them only winning 20 games? So yeah, a lot of those players that played under Michael Jordan, or even the role players, they went on to be productive. Tony Kukoc, another example. So yeah, playing under Michael Jordan, it may have been hell. He may not have been the nicest person to deal with, but there was results in that. And I strongly believe if you put Scottie Pippen on some mediocre team, he would not have been what he was. As a matter of fact, the last year that Scottie Pippen was an All-Star was 1996-97. He was not an All-Star playing with the Houston Rockets, and he was not an All-Star playing with the Portland Trailblazers. Okay? He just wasn't. And when he first came into the NBA, Scottie was a guy averaging 7 points a game. All right? And there were even doubts about whether he would even pan out because, if I remember correctly, I think in between his first and second season, I forget exactly when it happened, but I think in between his first and second season, he had back surgery. And you know, back surgeries can be career threatening. So there was doubts about him. You know, but this notion that Scottie and him are on the same level, not career wise. As a matter of fact, the first series, playoff series, those two played together. Scottie Pippen averaged 10 points per game. Jordan averaged 45 in that series. So there goes that theory about they were a tandem from the get-go. Now, the second three-peat, they were more or less, Jordan was still the man, but he needed Scottie more during the second three-peat. He needed his teammates more because he wasn't quite the same player that he was from 84 to 93. So he needed his teammates more, right? He recognized that. And Scottie, by that point, was in his 30s. And in that era, when, you know, defense was important. If you didn't play defense back then as a team, you weren't going to win anything, especially in the Eastern Conference. So Scottie Pippen often guarded during the second three-peat. I'll give Scottie his due on this. He often guarded the other team's most dangerous offensive player. But unfortunately, because Scottie was getting older and he didn't drive to the basket as much, and he took more three-pointers, sometimes ill-advised three-pointer shots, in my opinion, his field goal percentage suffered for that. All right? But Scottie was never like when Michael played, at least. No, he was never seen as equal. He was great, but he was never on the same level. And let me just give one other example of why, you know, you can't always go on this win percentage shit. Remember, the Raptors had a higher win percentage in 2019 when Kawhi Leonard wasn't playing than when he did play. Remember during the regular season, that crazy stat where they won over 70% of their games when he wasn't playing versus 68 or 67% of the games when he did play? Well, I mean, that's just one of those weird stats. It don't mean anything. Nobody would believe that the team was better without Kawhi Leonard. Reality set in 95 because not only were you without Michael Jordan, but now you don't have an interior defensive presence. You're soft as Twinkie dough on the inside. Tony Kukoc could not contain anybody. He was not a great defender. And that's partially why, even with the great coaching, they fell all the way down to below 500 briefly. And with 34 and 31, Michael Jordan returned from his retirement. So, and at the end of the video, I'm pretty much saying, look, Scottie was a great player, but he was not on the same level as Michael Jordan. And he also didn't quite reach the level that we thought he was going to reach. We thought he was going to be this superstar scorer, playmaker, like Grant Hill numbers is what I'm pretty much trying to say. We thought that he was going to be Grant Hill when Michael retired. 25, 26, 27, 8 rebounds, 7 assists. No. 22, 6, and 5. That's Scottie. Not bad. But anyway, that's just my take on it, man. Tell me what you guys think.